Okay, here it is. Kinesiology 230, Chapter 5, Presentation number 8. Almost there. Still talking chronic adaptations to resistance training. We're now on page 80 and 81, both metabolic, endocrine, cardiorespiratory, and body composition. This will be a lot of material, kind of covered in a compressed fashion. So let's buckle up. So here we are. We started off on page 75. We made our way to page like 80, 81, and let's get rolling. These are the last four things in that list that we originally talked about a few presentations ago. Again, go back. I would review the material as best you can in the book, but use that to help support what I'm talking about in the presentations here. Metabolic changes. The book states that research has shown chronic resistance training induces a variety of cellular changes that affect metabolism of skeletal muscle, which is great, right? When you talk about resistance training, it's anaerobic, and then therefore one would presume that the adaptations should also be anaerobic within the phosphagen system and also glycolysis. In the book up here, they talk about the difference in training mode and volume. Differences in outcomes between studies likely reflect differences in training mode and volume and indicate the importance of designing programs to meet specific needs of individual clients. And I agree with that. I'm on board with that. But they specify that, however, it's likely that higher volume resistance training upregulates creatine kinase as well as various glycolytic enzymes, whereas low volume, high load training has marginal effects. So here we are. If your goal when you're training is to go for creatine kinase upregulation and also have some type of like glycolysis upregulation, you're talking higher volume training, right? It's pretty straightforward. It's not saying one is right or one is wrong, kind of to determine what it is you're looking to do. So from a practical perspective, what they note down here is the endurance capacity of a muscle to lift weights for more repetitions typically increases with resistance training, and this is likely due to an increase in creatine kinase as well as glycolytic enzyme levels. I would also contest it's likely because a person can push around more weight because they have a higher maximal rate. My higher max, 1 rep max, they're able to push more weight around in their workouts. So if I can only bench press 100 pounds, I certainly can't rep 100 pounds more than once. But if my max is 200 pounds, I could probably rep 100 pounds at least a good 18 to 20 times. So my point is this. When you get into the real practical side of this, like the nuts and the bolts of it, and you look at like doing strength training, and you're far over on one side of the spectrum where you're doing very high rep work, which is not aerobic work, don't get me wrong. But what happens is when you go into a higher repetition side of the continuum, that would be dictated more for people who are training for aerobic oriented sports. Whereas if you can think of it like on two ends of the spectrum, you have throwers on one side in track and field, and you have distance runners on the other side. Think of the somatotypes. When you're working with your throwers, you're not going to be doing sets of 15 to 20 repetitions. Meanwhile, over here with your endurance runners, you're not going to do sets of 3 to 4. It's counterintuitive. So my point to you is this. When you're working with your people, you got to realize the population you're working for. And if you're going for strength and power and explosiveness, you have individuals that can probably throw around a ton of weight. And my point to you is, if I asked either one of them to do 50% of their 1 rep max on an exercise, your distance runners, they'll have a much lower maximum. They'll also have a much lower workout weight at 50% than the other folks who are throwers. But what will probably become apparent is the people who are doing 50%, who are the endurance runners, endurance athletes, and they're working at a much lower weight, they can probably do that 50% much more effectively than the throwers because they already have built in and in place training adaptations for more aerobically oriented exercise, and they can tolerate that type of work where your throwers just are not accustomed to doing that type of work. All right, I digress. I'm going to go back to the presentation. So with that, let's go ahead and get moving. I'm going to scroll myself out of the way if you want to do this. You can go ahead and look at metabolic changes due to resistance training if you want on Google Scholar. I cut and paste it right in here for you so you can review that. Let's move the heck on. All right, so endocrine changes, bouts of exercise change the concentration of hormones during and after exercise. And then chronic effects of resistance training are just not as clear. We know in the short-term window, in the time of the workout and shortly thereafter, there are changes in hormonal levels, right? But it's just not as readily apparent to see in terms of chronic effects, maybe several weeks down the road. So chronic resistance training may affect the endocrine response and sensitivity of hormones, but we don't know 100% for sure at this point. Training upregulates muscle androgen receptor content. We kind of talked a little bit about that in the anabolic side too, 2 presentations ago. And then you have this greater ability to have interaction at the hormone receptor in the muscle itself. So again, same thing. I went out and did a little search of resistance training, upregulation of hormone receptors for testosterone, blah, 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 blah. Hopefully it's something that you'll be able to read through and you'll enjoy. Cardiorespiratory changes. Now, strength training per se, like our throwers that we were talking about before, that would not be cardiovascular oriented activity. The folks who are the runners, that would be definitely cardiovascular activity. Strength training though, you have an increase in respiration, you have an increase of oxygen demand, you have an increase in the need to blow off CO2. But when you get into something like a HIIT, like a high intensity interval training protocol, where it's you're still using weights, but you're working at a very high level and a very high intensity, it can cause a cardiovascular-like response in the participant, but it's not going to be true cardio, right? Because cardio itself, and we'll talk about this in a minute, has requirements in terms of how long, what's supposed to be, the rhythmic nature of it, etc. But I'll tell you, if you do a HIIT style training program, you can elicit a cardio-like response where the heart rate's elevated, the respiration is elevated, and you'll have increases that are very indicative of what would be like cardiovascular responses, but you're using weights and it's to be considered anaerobic. Just saying. So with strength training, you can raise your VO2 max, but in untrained individuals. So when you have untrained people and you start doing strength training, their bodies will respond in a way where even their VO2 max will go up. Now, eventually, once they've had time in a workout program, what you'll see is their VO2 max will not go up any further. It'll almost like plateau out unless you start to introduce in cardiovascular training with those individuals. So the ACSM states that cardiovascular exercise is a rhythmic activity that uses large muscle groups over a period of at least 20 vigorous minutes or 30 moderate minutes of work for 5 days a week. Now, I will tell you again, you could do a HIIT style program, and I've done this with clients where I've done an hour twice a week with individuals, and they do cardio on their own, they do other workouts on their own. So it fits the protocol that they're talking about here, but it would not be classically considered cardiorespiratory or cardiovascular style training, just so you know. So body composition changes. When I talk with clients and I talk with people about body composition, I always reference a 2-compartment model. You have fat weight and fat-free weight. And I hope the next slides will help you in understanding this a little bit further, and also help you in terms of calculating. So strength training will help increase the amount of fat-free mass in the individual, FFM, fat-free mass. And long-term resistance training can also reduce overall body mass due to caloric burn. So you can have 2 things going on here, one of which is you pack on more muscle, you stay the same weight, you don't burn any fat off, but because you put on more, you pack on more muscle, you put on lean muscle mass or fat-free mass. And because you're putting on more fat-free mass, that's going to change your actual body fat percentage. Sorry about that. And then if you go ahead and work out more and more and more and more, you might have the continued addition of fat-free mass. You start burning some body fat off, and actually your overall body weight either stays the same or kind of calibrates and goes lower because you're burning calories during your workouts. When you look at the 2-compartment model, that's comprised of fat weight and fat-free weight. Fat is the baggage, that's what goes along for the ride. And then the fat-free weight is comprised of muscle, connective tissue, ligaments, bones, organs, all the stuff that we've been talking about so far in this class. And when you look at doing body composition, we'll often have people do like the handheld, or they're doing a Tatana scale. Skin fold calipers is also very common, or other types of bioelectrical impedance where they're standing on a scale holding the handle like the InBody that we use. And when you have this, they're basically several main nuggets of information you got to capture, one of which is the person's body weight, their percent body fat, and their lean body mass. And really with body weight and body fat percentage, you can calculate everything else quite easily. So let's look at this. If a person comes in, they weigh 205 and their body fat is 29%, we can calculate that out. They weigh 205 pounds, their body fat is 29%. If we go 0.29 times 205, that gives us 59.5. They're carrying around almost 60 pounds of fat weight as they walk around all day. And their fat-free weight is 145 and a half. Pretty easy to calculate out, right? And then when you talk with people about where they can go with this, and your client tells you they would like to lose 15 pounds to get to 190, okay, so here's what we know. Here's our baseline. If we get to 190 and you lose 15 pounds and our fat weight, our fat-free weight doesn't change, so we're still at 145.5, 145.5, but I will tell you, with some strength training, that number will probably go up maybe a pound or so. But just for sake of showing your client, your fat-free weight stays the same. Well, if you lose 15 pounds here and your fat-free weight stays the same, you'll end up dropping from 59 and 59.45 down to 44.45. You're going to lose your 15 pounds here, which means your flow through is the body fat percent goes from 29 to 23. It's mathematically, it's something you can show mathematically to your client to get them to understand and wrap themselves around what that looks like and what that'll feel like. And, there's many ways to do this. I've had clients tell me they want to lose X amount of weight. I'm like, there's no way. If you do the math on it, look what has to happen. You're going to have to cut off an arm to lose that weight. But to really take a client and say, look, if you want to lose 15 pounds and we're going to do this right, now you can map this out over the next 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, whatever it is, to get them to this point. It's mathematically something you can show them. So with that, guys, I'm going to jump out of this and go into the next presentation.